Hey, everybody. Welcome back. This is Marcus with the Econ Playground, and we're continuing our read through of Law and Revolution by Harold Berman. And these are some really cool chapters. We're moving into part 2, which focuses less on canon law and more on secular law. But the questions of canon law and the role of the church are certainly not lost on us. They're still really focal and still really important to the story that Berman is telling. So yeah, let's just get right into it. We've split up we're reading 6 chapters this week, chapters 7 through 12. And so each one of us is covering 2 chapters. And I'm going to start talking about chapters 7 and 8. The first chapter, chapter 7, is telling the story of Thomas Becket and Henry II. So for anyone that hasn't read it or doesn't know the story, I'll just start by explaining the series of events. So Henry II is the King of England in the latter portion of the 12th century. You might not have heard of him, but you have definitely probably heard of his sons, King Richard the Lionheart, who was very famous in the Crusades, and King John, who was famous for being a terrible king. And they're kind of featured in the Disney Robin Hood as the tiger is King John, and then Richard the Lion is the Lionheart. But Henry II is really important because of these other things that are happening in his reign that we're going to be talking about. And so basically what happens is during his reign, there becomes an opening in the seat of Canterbury, the main archbishopric, the main diocese, archdiocese in England. And so what Henry does is he's sort of in the position where he can put the bishop in power at this point. So what he does is he puts in his good friend, who's actually the king's chancellor, which is one of the highest positions that you can have in England at the time, the chancellor and his good friend Thomas Becket. And so Becket is sort of rapidly sort of elevated through deacon, priest, bishop, and he's given the archbishopry. And Henry thinks, oh, well, this means that, my guy's in the seat and we're going to have a good time and I can basically tell the church to do whatever I want it to do. But that's not really the case. And Becket ends up resigning his chancellorship and ending up promoting the cause of church independence. And one of the things that Henry tries to do is pass a series of laws that are called the Constitutions of Clarendon, which really are this kind of medieval law, which seemed like these declarations of the king that the king makes, and then whether or not the lords respect them or not is kind of how the voting gets done, right? And so most notably, 2 of the aspects of the Constitutions of Clarendon that were really relevant were, one, that the king prosecutes all the cases of murder or theft or these other normal, sort of domestic crimes by the clergy, whereas previously, or in canon law, this is supposed to be done by the church. The ecclesiastical authorities and the canon law courts are the ones that would process any sort of case that has to do with a priest. And the Constitution of Clarendon wants to clarify, no, actually, this is the king's role. And then Berman also notes that one part of the Constitutions of Clarendon would actually make the king one of the arbiters, one of the most supreme arbiters in the canon law system as it's executed in England. It's basically the king trying to claim that independent canon law system will now be part of his royal law. And Becket really pushes against this, and it all comes to a head in a case where a priest actually murdered someone else, and the king wants to prosecute the priest in his own courts, but Becket says that this has to be kept independent in the ecclesiastical courts, and there's a clash over this. And Henry at one point says in front of a few of his closest followers that he wants to get rid of this pestilential priest. And as a result, it's not clear. I think most historians say it wasn't Henry that actually told them to do this, but a few armed thugs basically attack Thomas Becket in the cathedral and kill him. And so this is this terrible, terrible event. And Henry ends up basically conceding the Constitutions of Clarendon, and they don't get passed and they're not followed. And Becket's death sort of secures the independence for the church that he was fighting for. As a result, Henry ends up going through like some penance and really showing a display that Becket was right. And so why he exactly conceded even after Becket's death, it's not clear if it was out of guilt or there was other pressure from the church. It's not clear, but this story is like a really great little, in a nutshell, a lot of the themes that are in the book about there being multiple legal systems in Europe, sort of that might be considered for like a murder case. Like we normally today would think that's something that the king should handle, but back then when they had this system of canon law, and supposedly the priests are supposed to be under that law, it's not clear what's going to happen. So this is really a great case of those two systems clashing, and when it seems like that actually won't work out. And one of the other things that he brought up in the chapter that I thought was really interesting was actually saying that Becket, even though he's appealing to this great tradition of canon law, like Berman is saying in the book, that notion that the church has its own law and is completely independent of all these kings is something that's newer. At least it's new in the sense that it's really practiced thoroughly after the papal revolution. And so Berman says that Henry I, who's Henry II's grandfather, actually had more supremacy over the church. And some of the things that Henry tried to secure in the Constitutions of Clarendon, Henry actually already had some of those powers. But right after Henry's reign is the reign of King Stephen, which is not really a reign. And so that period is called the Anarchy because Stephen is fighting with another claimant to the throne who's called Empress Maud. And so the king really has little to no power in Britain. And one very interesting thing is that the justice in England during that period, during the period of the Anarchy, is when is often executed by the church and by the monasteries, which exploded during that period. And if you guys, I would definitely recommend this series called Cadfile, which is a series of books, but it's also a series of TV shows at one point, which is kind of like Miss Marple or something like that, but it's about a monk named Cadfile in the monastery of Shrewsbury during the Anarchy, who like solves mysteries in the local village and stuff like that, while there's no king to be being the prosecutor and stuff. It's mostly local village mysteries and stuff like that, but it's really cool. And it's basically, the church in this time is they would go to the abbot, and the abbot would be the one that is adjudicating disputes and stuff like that. But so it's after this period that Henry comes back and tries to reassert power over the church that his grandfather had, that they lost during the Anarchy, and he's not able to do it. So it's very curious. It's not clear. Did that period that the church had as the very prominent sort of keeper of justice during the Anarchy, did that sort of give room for Becket to do what he did? It's very interesting. I don't know. That's something to be investigating more. And another thing, just from other reading that I've done, that Henry VIII during the English Reformation, and Thomas Cromwell, who was really the main mind behind the English Reformation, really when they're reforming a lot of the liturgical practices in the English Church, they go through a lot of the prayer books, and of course they're crossing out the name of the Pope, and they're saying you can't give reference to Rome or the papal see in the liturgy. But even more so than that, they're removing the name of Thomas Becket from prayer books, because he's one of the major saints in late medieval England, and he really, to them, somehow represented that the English king is not the defender of the faith, or is not the ruler of church in England. So Becket is making a really Becket is basically the symbol of that historical claim, specifically about Britain and about the English king, that he's not the ruler of the church in this region, and that sort of equilibrium has been respected for the past 300 years to when the English Reformation happens. And so this story of Henry II and Becket is a really key sort of representation of that there are competing legal systems in Europe, the canon law and the royal or the various other secular laws, and that actual choice between those legal systems is one of the preservers of freedom. The fact that in one court you can refer to an element of canon law or refer to an element of the secular or feudal or manorial laws or the merchant law or the urban law, all these things that we're going to be talking about, that since the law is not in control of any single authority, that's actually somehow the source of people's freedom. But the question is, how secure is that that freedom, and how dependent is it on these personal relationships between Henry and the bishop and the local authorities and the monasteries and stuff? How dependent is it on all these fragile personal relationships? And that sort of gets into chapter 8, which is
let's talk about the first chapter first, and then we'll
sure
on to the next. I think you kind of captured hit all the points. The way you were talking about it, though, suggested, I think, only one of the two parts of why it's important. It is a representation. It's a synecdoche of the issue. It's like a beautiful episode that kind of illustrates the story and the relationship between these two different legal systems and competition with one another, etc. And also, I think it's talking about how this episode had important effects on advancing that jurisdictional competition, and especially in England and how it defined it in England, right? So trying to think about what that was. So it's, as you were saying, so Henry II is trying to restore his authority and also the ancient law of the land. I mean, maybe some part of both. So that the anarchy of Stephen is interpreted by him as being a period of unlaw, and a restoration of law is just going back to what existed before Stephen. Whereas the church sees, actually, it was a period of constitutional change where they gained authority, and the legal situation did change because they did gain authority. So there's this papal struggle. Royal weakness allows the church to gain some constitutional authority in jurisdictional matters. But the killing of Becket forces Henry II to retreat because of public opinion and or because of personal guilt. And so that explains why some of the things in English law are unique. And I think how listeners have heard of the benefit of clergy. If they haven't, it's such an interesting phenomenon. Like even I think until the early 1800s, if someone memorized the passage from the Bible, and they said it at the right time during a if they'd committed a felony, they just said this line from the Bible, they would not be executed. So where the heck did that come from? How could it be that if you're in a trial, you're convicted of murder, and then before they hang you, they say, do you have anything to say? Can you read this? They put the Bible in front of you, and if you just memorize or read the line, you don't get executed. It's funky. So weird. It exists in England for a very long time, called benefit of the clergy. So where did that come from, right? And it comes from Henry II saying, in matters of felony, it's the church's jurisdiction. And then the evolution to see because the church were the literate group of society, how do you prove that you're under, the jurisdiction of the church? Either you are a cleric and you can read, or you're in one of the universities, which is also under the clerical jurisdiction. So if you're literate, you can do this. So it advances the separation. It's actually there's this tension. How is it resolved? It's resolved by a very popular person being killed and the other party feeling guilt and or needing popular support. And so kind of ceding much more than otherwise would have had to be ceded in terms of royal authority to the church jurisdiction, setting up a new equilibrium in England with these competing jurisdictions.
Yeah, we see this the problem with Becket that plays out is only possible because during Stephen, the church had the ability to step up and have this canon law developed and ready. So that only happens because of the papal revolution that happens immediately prior. And so it's this very unique set of situations that is playing itself out in a novel way, because prior to the papal revolution, if a king became weak, it wasn't like the church automatically filled this gap as this independent transnational association that can provide a different set of law. It can provide canon law to guide and adjudicate different problems and situations. And so this very novel creation of the church is something different and apart from the state that allows it to be something other than the state that steps in to fill this gap. And then once that gap becomes no longer necessary for the church to fill, now you have to fight about who gets authority over what. And so it's the overlap, the places where the jurisdictions overlap, that things become contested and interesting, because these are the places where the identity of what it is to be the state and what it is to be the church or the sacred are confused and not clear. And the interesting process of working out who has jurisdiction over what is more than just different legal codes fighting the, having a battle royale and seeing who's going to take over what, but it's also this interesting like quest for identity amongst these institutions, where they're trying to figure out what their role is, and then how do you live that out. And so ceding ground on who gets to adjudicate what is more than just giving away some power, but it's also a change in how organizations think about themselves and conceptualize themselves. So it's this very interesting battle to understand identities within these complicated and nested polities.
Absolutely. The two things that are striking me as very interesting. One is that the interpretation of the so-called anarchy as unlaw is contested, right? So the royal party, it was obviously a period of civil war and extreme insecurity. People were there were highway robbers and that kind of stuff. And nobles, not only the church, but nobles ceded power to themselves when the king was weak. And that could be locally exploitative, right? So there was a way in which there was less law and security in certain matters. But as you're saying, the church is a substitute that is providing law. So it's not entirely unlaw, right? It's and so where the power lies shifts, and so where the law is and what its source is shifts. So to what extent is anarchy, right? It's like a question of relative, and even in a period that seems like decay, something can be growing that can become a substitute and perhaps in some ways preferable to what existed before. And then the second thing is, it's one of the things that Berman emphasizes, and I think he concurs with Maitland in this. So Maitland thinks it was just anarchy. Berman thinks more of the latter, that was more complicated. But he agrees with Maitland that there's no definitive line between the sacred and the secular. Insofar as you're dealing with the world, there's no way to draw an objective line of demarcation of jurisdictions. And so there's a battle, there's an essence to one and the other, and why they think that one should have its power rather than the other, but where that boundary is has to be defined or become focal through some other process than pure reason. And so this episode with Becket, both the anarchy and then the episode with Becket are interesting in that after the anarchy, something has to happen to make this focal, and it's a battle. Is power over felony and punishing felonies going to lie with the crown or with the church? Nobody knows. There's no answer, actually. There is no answer. And interestingly, in France, it's entirely the opposite of England. So in France, the king maintains, I guess, is the duchy still? I don't know what part of France, but I remember Berman saying in France, the church has power over lesser crimes less than felony, and the crown punishes felonies. Whereas in England, the crown has no power over felons, but has power over lesser crimes. So there's no like objective answer where the jurisdiction of the church versus the state lies. And it's these kind of particular battles that draw the line and make them focal. And once the king says, okay, these are the Constitutions of Clarendon, Becket says, and then the king says, okay, maybe something I said got you dead. And so now this is what it is. That becomes what it is. But weirdly, why is it that this pronouncement of the king in this political situation creates the focality, the focalness that people accept as law? Now it is law, right? And future kings and church somehow have to acknowledge that that is the law, that is the focal rule. And we can either get back to fighting each other and killing each other, or we acknowledge now this is the law. So that's just kind of funky that something that starts in politics and is contingent then becomes a rule, a focal rule that somehow gets respected. And what is it about the time, the people, and their attitudes that cause them to accept law or make this contingent moment of pronouncement the final say on these matters, and a marker, a landmark by which to navigate future conflicts?
Yeah, I think 2 points that are related is, so one of the big plot elements of the CAD file stories is, oh, some murder happens in the village or somebody's killed, right? And all of a sudden people are accusing this guy, this new guy that came into town for the fair or whatever. And so a mob is chasing after him. And you know, like if the mob catches him, we don't know what they're going to do with him, right? But as soon as he enters the door of the monastery, people like respect it, right? So the physical boundaries of them, and then once he's inside the monastery, they can actually say, okay, can we actually adjudicate this? Can we try to get some evidence? And then they actually try to come to a resolution. And then whatever resolution the monastery comes to, whatever the abbot decides, that's what the sheriff and the mob is going to respect more, right? So there might actually be this really, like, this is during the anarchy period. It probably still is fair to kind of call it anarchy, because the church doesn't have that same presence or like strength or universality that the king might have, right? So the church did not come into the world to be the legal adjudicator, right? But they can present it, and they can present the vision of it. So in like that anarchy period, even, I'm curious if someone's really tried to study if areas where there were monasteries during the anarchy, if they had better legal resolution. I don't know if there's a way to measure that or anything. I'd be curious about it. But I think that like what you were just saying, Andrew, this chapter is so important because throughout, especially the chapters that we're talking about today, he'll like reiterate his claim that the papal revolution was really, really like they wouldn't, yeah, of course they developed all these laws and they developed all these ideas at this time, and it was very practical and useful for them to develop these laws, but they wouldn't have been able to do it if they didn't have that model of the canon law, if they didn't have that aspiration or that imagination that there can be a universal integrated law that we can all follow. And sometimes when I read him make that claim, I'm like, okay, I get what you're saying, but give me the historical evidence, the moments where that matters, the moment where that hits. And it's not just a claim that people were inspired out of the goodness of their hearts by the canon law. And I think it's in chapters like this where it's really relevant, where what he's saying is it's at the sort of the awkward moments, at the moments where the jurisdictions overlap, at the moments where you don't know what's going on, that whatever the intellectual milieu, whatever's going on in the universities this whole time, that's when it all of a sudden makes itself known. When you reach a fork in the road where a tradition or custom is not totally clear, where people are making claims where the resolution isn't simple and obvious, that's when you start to refer to the higher thought. And that's when in economic history, in history in general, and telling the story, like he says later on at the end of the urban law chapter, that's when you have to talk about those subjective ideological elements, and that's when they actually have real force. That's when justice or ideas about justice actually have a force, and that's what's shown in this chapter. And
that even though there is this struggle, there is a commitment to law and a belief that there is a legal answer, and they're trying to find it. So it's not just that they're conflicting customs or traditions or beliefs, but there's a more fundamental underlying belief that there is a law, that there is an answer to resolve this. Could we read a big chunk of 268? Because I think it's really pertinent to kind of getting to this sense of legal spirit of the age, according to Berman. It's on 268, the second half, where it says, Both Henry and Becket attached great importance to the legal definition of the boundaries between their respective jurisdictions. Both started with the expectation, by then almost universally shared, that a legal solution could be found to the question of ecclesiastical versus secular control over matters in which both had strong conflicting interests. So this kind of distinction between law and mere interest. The resort to force by Henry's men was an affront to the expectation. It resulted in an almost universal revulsion, which in turn compelled the English crown to renounce its most extreme claims. To be sure, time was on the side of the expanse of the secular jurisdiction. However, such shifts in the balance of power had to be carried out in the context of legal competition and compromise. The competition between the ecclesiastical and secular courts had a lasting effect on the Western legal tradition. Plural jurisdictions and plural legal systems became the hallmark of Western legality. Seems to be kind of emphasize what we've been saying.
And it's that mutual need that they have to respect the law, and that it's something that they're working on together, because as is obvious in the murder of Becket, the king is the one with all the swords on his side, right? So he's the one with the material power, and the one that, yeah, he could make up, he writes up the Constitutions of Clarendon. And why aren't those just all of a sudden the law of the land?
Yeah.
So and it is important that the king is relatively weak relative to his barons, and that he needs to represent himself as someone following the law to have it work out. But it's also not like the church can just make up whatever they want and say, the church says you need to do this and you need to follow it. They're both revolving around something that everyone recognizes as legitimate or reasonable, and that's a project that all of Europe, or all the people they're conversing with, are doing at the same time.
Absolutely. And to be clear, it's not that Henry II just sits down and writes this thing called the Constitutions of Clarendon. He brings together barons and churchmen who don't necessarily agree with the Becket position, to find out what was the law in the time of his grandfather, before Stephen, and because that is the law according to. So it's both interest, but it's based in law. It's interest expressed through an attempt to establish what the law is, or define what the law is. And maybe read one more line just below what I read about plural jurisdiction becoming a hallmark of the Western legal tradition. He talks about Blackstone, writing in the 18th century, says that English law consists of natural law, divine law, international law, ecclesiastical law, Roman law, law merchant, local customs, common law, statute law, and equity. Right. So it's not it's these are the law, and it's like this mosaic of all these things that are being passed down and grow. Not the law is what Parliament says, although Parliament is taking on a new role of sovereignty to be able to change these things. And Blackstone acknowledges that Parliament can basically change anything it wants. There's no sovereign above it. Parliament has inherited the law, and it has this plurality, this plural nature to it. Should we go on to the next chapter?
Yeah, I don't have so much more to add about this chapter, but it's really interesting. The one thing that I wanted to mention to connect the two is I've also been reading this book, The Evolution of Medieval Thought by David Knowles, who himself was a Benedictine monk. And I just read his chapter on John of Salisbury, and one thing that he happens to mention, Salisbury grew up as I think a burgher somewhere in England, and it's possible actually that he was present in the cathedral when Becket was murdered. And he's writing right after that period. He ends up going to Rome too and writing in Rome. But John of Salisbury is sort of the main character of chapter 8, and specifically a book that he wrote called Polycraticus, I think.
And the title of chapter 8 is The Concept of Secular Law.
Yes.
Right? So it's this transition from the canon to what is the secular.
Yeah, and what he says is, and the secular law covers a lot of those things that Andrew just listed, that Blackstone listed as the elements of law in England. And what he says is that what Berman says is that secular law is many where canon law was one. So we're moving from this this single set of laws that the church is working on as sort of is going to apply universally everywhere in Europe, to all of these local laws that develop because of particular problems. But like we said, when they reach these sort of headway, awkward, messy points, they always have this canon law or this universal law or this belief and desire that there's something greater to sort of appeal to and to refer to. And it's not like they're directly taking notes from the canon law. It's not like wherever the secular law has a hole, they pull in something from the canon law, but they sort of use it as an umbrella model, as something that we're always going to be able to refer up to. So what John of Salisbury is really adding to the table, you can really think of him as the beginning of what we think of as political philosophy in the West, right? And his focal concern is that there's this guy, the prince, that sort of developed and is now a relatively stable figure throughout Europe. There's a king of England, there's a king of France, there's a Holy Roman Emperor. And so what Salisbury is addressing is that role, the king, and that the prince represents one, Christ, in that he's the person that's going to be bringing order to the world, right? Like the Logos bringing order to chaos, but also he represents his people and the particular problems that they're going to have. So the prince is tasked with subjecting himself to the laws that are above him, since he's only a particular part of the world, but also representing those problems and figuring them out himself. So he sort of brings up the idea of as the jurisdiction or the geographical area that the king is responsible for as sort of the body politic. Since this is an area being subjected to one legal system, we can think of it as a body operating according to its own principles, like how my body is subject to my head. The body of the nation, sort of my body actually, whatever the principles that make me, Marcus, all the historical things that have driven all this matter to be in the place that it is, in the shape that it is, are sort of like the king or the principle that orders me. And so I'm the way that my body is subject to various natural laws, so is this body politic. And it's something that a lot of libertarians like to say today, or people casually like to say today, is like the borders between nations. Well, those are just lines that someone drew on a map. They don't really mean anything. But I think that the way that Salisbury is thinking is that, well, they clearly do mean something, because what they mean is that there's because of the way that law and legal systems and the history of how people have fought over these lands has developed, what is on either side of the line means something. You're part of this body politic or part of that body politic. Now, maybe borders should be changed. Maybe some of them should be erased. I don't know. That's a matter for the higher legal system, maybe. But that there is a body politic that you can think about as a place where we need to develop and clarify law is what Salisbury is putting forward. And it's basically the blank slate for the rest of Western political philosophy. And it's already this sort of setup, who's going to be the sovereign? How are we going to limit them? How are we going to subject them to higher laws? Are we going to do that at all? And so, like, from Hobbes to Locke to Hume, Rousseau, all of those people are already kind of operating in this mindset. There's a body politic and we're going to think through it. And this is a quote from page 287. He says, although Aristotle's politics was not available to John of Salisbury, he shared with Aristotle the view that the political community is subject to the law of nature, which is reason, and that nature or reason requires the king to rule according to justice and equity. This view is explicit in the Polycraticus, and it is also implicit in the metaphor of the body politic. So the main point that he makes by the end of the chapter is that the rule of law is not an alien concept to the medievals. And that what's sort of developing in this period is things like the Magna Carta is that the legal system that's created by the Papal Revolution and this whole period is that there is a law, and that our job is to subject the various body politics to that law and to think through it. So we think of the rule of law as something that developed only in the modern period, but Berman is saying that's not the case.
Cool. I think that there's one thing that I thought was interesting. I don't know how I haven't not read John of Salisbury, and it's been some time since I read Aristotle's Politics. But Aristotle starts the Politics by saying that the individual, quote unquote, is not the end, it's not a whole, because the individual is not self-sufficient. And an end or a whole needs to be in some way self-sufficient. And because an individual can't really subsist without others, the individual per se can't be the final end to which things are moving, and that somehow establishes the normative standard. And not only is the family the basic and necessary unit of the village, but the city or polis is the ideal, because it allows the human being to live a good life, not just survive, but and so and somehow the whole of the city is the normative end. I don't know how that relates to the welfare of the individual, but it says on 287 here in Berman claims that Aristotle's political theory, the highest end of the human life, is the common good of the political community. In the Polycraticus by John of Salisbury, it's taken for granted. So there's this body, right? Polycraticus is using this idea of the corpus, this community as a corpus, and people being parts. But he says in the Polycraticus, it's taken for granted that the political community is subordinate to the salvation of human souls under the judgment of God. And so there's like another step. It's like the political community is actually for the individuals somehow. It's like they're both acknowledging that there's this requirement for the body to be, the common good is necessary, but is the individual for the common good, or is the common good for the individual, and how do you put those things together? But Berman's claiming that kind of Salisbury's Christian individualism, not separate, not atomism or the individualism in the Tocquevillian negative sense, but the moral finality of the individual and his or her salvation is the point for which everything else is a means. And I'm not sure how to assess those two things, but it's an interesting, for those of us interested in the kind of the origins of modern and liberal thought and how Christianity plays a role in that. How does the idea of the body politic, where is the individual versus the body, and how do we figure that out? Just sharing my confusion. I don't know if that's helpful, but
yeah. But in the point that the purpose of the state is to promote the good of the whole of this political community, but then that includes the salvation of the souls of these individuals, also reincorporates or brings back this confusion or messiness over the dividing lines between the ecclesiastical and the secular, because while he's still describing the purpose of a secular state, it's not secular as we think about it today, as totally divorced from any kind of religious consideration, because again the purpose is salvation of souls is one of these purposes within this secular state. And so it brings back this religious purpose within what the secular state is doing. And so then it this definition of what it is for a secular state to exist and what its purpose is brings back and incorporates this tension between these boundaries between the secular, the temporal, and the ecclesiastical and the eternal or higher things. So he's drawing a line, John of Salisbury, that does divide off the secular and the ecclesiastical, but it has a definition that retains this tension between the two, where it's clearly not resolved, and it sets up future tension for continuous battle and struggle and compromise throughout the history of England, the development of ecclesiastical structures in the English state.
One of the things he emphasizes, two of the themes he's emphasized throughout the book is that, or he's punctuated at points, is that the canon law and the body of the church serves as a model for secular law, a model for the secular state. And the other point is that kind of the transformation of the thought about how the secular and the sacred relate is that the sacred has a role in reforming the secular. So that it's like the purpose of the secular state or secular law is to provide social conditions that maximize the opportunity for individual salvation. Or, it's like, it's not that there's actually a divine role for the secular, even though they're separate jurisdictions and they should be separate on some level. And this thing that we've been emphasizing, he says it again in this chapter on 292, the two powers could only coexist peacefully through a shared recognition of the rule of law and its supremacy over each. And on 293, he kind of says that there were kind of three sources of this idea of rule of law in the Western tradition. The first is that the concept of the rule of law was supported by the prevailing religious ideology. Okay, so he's saying that this religious thought coming out of the papal revolution is putting law somehow above, that law is of God and needs to be respected as kind of a divine purpose on earth. Secondly, that it was supported by the weakness of rulers and the pluralism of authorities and jurisdictions. So it's just a fact, just like in the Anarchy of Stephen, it's just a fact that there is no dominant law provider. And so something has to be done as a practical matter, to create order in among these conflicting and competing sources of law. And thirdly, the concept of the rule of law was supported by the high level of legal consciousness and legal sophistication that came to prevail throughout the West in the 12th and 13th centuries. And he talks about it being embodied in some of the things we talked about before, including like Magna Carta and that kind of stuff. So the discovery of the Roman law, the creation of canon law, and the legal consciousness is giving people a solution. So laws of God, we need order. The fact is we have these competing jurisdictions. So we need to somehow put law as supreme. We need to solve this issue. Hey, we've got all these sophisticated legal principles and concepts and rules to achieve this objective, right? So law is supreme, and this is the law, and this is how we grow the law. So the concept of secular law comes out of the division of bifurcation of secular and sacred, and then the need to deal with this fact of competition and create jurisdiction.
I think the best word, and the word that he keeps using on later on, is integration, to try to help solve the problem of, well, the purpose of the individuals is the body politic, but a good body politic somehow respects those individuals. And that word integration that he uses over and over again, where we have, let's say, I don't know, mercantile law in this city and mercantile law in this city. And when those are integrated, those two cities can work together towards a higher unified purpose, but they're not integrated if, let's say, the king comes in and says, okay, now both of these cities have to follow my law. That does unify them somewhat, but it doesn't unify them under why they exist. So they exist because people came together and they wanted to live together. And if the law of those two cities is integrated, it's because somehow they both together found and shared something higher, instead of a tyrant coming in and basically that has nothing to do with the reason that the cities were founded, right? So later on, when he talks about the cities being founded in England, he talks about the king founding these cities, and sort of the urban law in England was unified under the king's sort of purview. So those sort of have a unified system of urban law developing along with the king law. That was a cooperative endeavor. But when he talks about the cities in the continent that are less dependent on the king, those might be more in conflict. So, but I like focusing on that word integration, because It's about bringing things together, but not destroying what they were beforehand, right? So just because the purpose of some part is for the whole doesn't mean that the part is no longer what it was before it was brought into that whole.
What you just said helped me understand what you quoted earlier on page 287, that you said that when the integration happens because there is a reason for the community, there's a reason for the rule. It's not just someone subjecting another to his or her power, his power usually, sometimes hers, okay. But it was on 287, it says, although Aristotle's politics was not available to John of Salisbury, he shared with Aristotle the view that the political community is subject to the law of nature, which is reason, and that nature or reason requires the king to rule according to justice and equity. So there's something, again, outside of mere power that's defining why this rule exists. And we got to find out what the reason is. I don't know if it was in this book or in Arthur Haig's, Hogue's Origins of the Common Law. He talks about kind of what constitutes age old, or, it's like anything older than 40 years, 50 years is age old, and then there's time immemorial. But again, the sense that if something is existing outside of someone remembering when it was created, and it's persisted and people have acted upon it, there's some kind of reason why it's there and continuing. And so to just reject it instead of recognizing that it is the custom, it is the custom. It's not this person's will or that person's decision. Once it's no longer remembered who made the decisions or what the conflict was, and everyone just knows that is the custom, there's a sense that there's a reason beyond power that causes it to be accepted and to persist, and that somehow that reason needs to be respected, maybe changed, but definitely respected, and not just thought, oh, we can just make it however you want. You may not know what that reason is. And it also relates to Edward Cook's claim that law is artificial reason. It's like there is reason there, but it's not something that you can just individually, cogitate about and come to the conclusion. Actually, you have to kind of know what the custom is. You have to acculturate yourself to what the reasoning of the law is to see its nature, rather than just think you can make it up in a kind of rationalist way.
So something that I should also add to make this clearer is, I don't think what any of us are saying is something like, if there's town A and town B and they want to sort of integrate to some higher purpose together, that they have to, everything that they were before that integration has to be completely contained, right? It may very well be that when you move in and you integrate into a higher whole, you have to give up part of what was previously custom or what was thought of as custom. So part of this integration process is actually realizing which things you should shed. And I think that that's a big thing that Berman is talking about, especially with like the Becket controversy, is what he's saying, well, what Becket was doing was appealing to a higher law that both the king and the church had to respect, but that actually required denying previously what had been received as custom, right? So like when two people come into a marriage, they're giving up all of the things that they could have done in their single life, like going and seeing other people. That's in a certain definition of marriage, but that you are actually giving up something in order to have something greater. So that sort of shedding of sin or dead weight is going to be part of the process of integration.
So I'm now a little bit confused about how to put a couple things together, because we've been saying the way we're understanding this reason was suggesting that custom that persists has some kind of reason. But one of the things that's been quoted several times, I don't remember who's the originator, but it's come up several times, is that the church would often say Jesus, or sorry, I should say Christ was the logos, not the custom. Christ was reason, not the custom, right? I think that's the phrase that's been used. So, and when Gratian categorizes and puts into hierarchy the different kinds of law, divine law, natural law, go down through human laws, church being above secular, and at the bottom is custom, and that actually the things above supersede custom. Because custom is law, but it doesn't trump these other things if they are law. Does that make sense? So, and saying that, you know, the somehow reason trumps mere habit, mere accepted tradition. So tradition and reason are not the same thing, but they are related. So as they're thinking of this concept of reason. So I'm not sure what to do with it.
To continue on the marriage example, that the institution of marriage itself, or the idea of a marriage contract itself, is a really good example of that, because it's something that existed in many societies before it was something considered as part of the church, right? So in the Roman Empire, there were many different types of marriages. There was marriage like between two noble families, or even just like a marriage for elevating a slave to your wife or something like that was also considered marriage. And when Roman citizens converted to Christianity, they didn't have to go through another marriage ceremony. So they weren't denying those previous Roman customs. But for example, something like polygamy, they said, well, that's something that might be part of your custom, but that it's not part of the reason of why you have this bond that you make in marriage. So that's something we're going to have to shed off, right? So it's about bringing what was already there, and sort of, if there is a higher law, or if there's this hope of a higher law, that you're integrating things in, the part of the process of the integration is cleaning off what was previously there.
And can you say what the reason is, as you understand it, that separates polygamy from monogamy?
I don't know. That's a whole nother topic, I guess.
Okay.
But there are cases that people make for polygamy too. So the fact that there are cases on either side, and you have to think through them, is why.
I'm just thinking about in church law, right? In canon law, what's the conception of reason that enables that the custom to be separated from a lawful form?
Well, there is there's almost a deeper custom appealed to, in that, you know, God only made one wife for Adam, or something like that. But I don't know strictly why that would deny multiple wives. But I think it's just in terms of why the church reaches that decision, it's a lot of meditation on scripture and things like the Mosaic law, and appealing to the Mosaic law as a standard for everything too.
Right, which is part of the divine law. That's positive divine law.
Yeah.
Let's move on. I think we got to go to the feudal and manorial law chapters.
Yeah, for Caleb.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. So I'm going to go through feudal and manorial law. I'll start walking through the feudal law, and we can pause, talk about that, and then start transitioning into the manorial law. And so Berman actually just starts off the feudal law section by critiquing and updating what people think about what feudalism is. He challenges the idea of feudalism and feudal society, and sees this as something that's coming out of the Enlightenment, but people prior to the Enlightenment wouldn't think of something called feudalism or feudal society, but would rather think of feudal law. And so you contrast this feudalism and feudal law, in that feudal law existed at a time where there were other competing legal systems. And so feudalism or feudal law existed as a legal system among legal systems. And so it's not that there was a feudal society where society is assumed or is fully captured by feudal law, but that there is feudal law within a broader society. So you can't call that a feudal society. That these feudal laws also exist at the same time as merchant law, which we'll get onto a little bit later, where merchant law is something that's seems like this hallmark of capitalism or moving towards a free market economy, and feudalism or feudal society is usually seen as being in contrast or incompatible with that. And so Berman starts to push these definitions and understandings by showing that these things actually existed side by side for a long time and actually developed together. And then Berman also argues that feudal and manorial law should be studied together. And so feudal law is the relationship of lords and vassals, where manorial law is lords and peasants, specifically lords and serfs. And while feudal manorial law exists prior, or feudal and manorial customs exist prior to the 11th century, he doesn't see them as being developed into a legal code or in elevated to some kind of legal status until after the Papal Revolution, where you have this rise of canon law and this ability for them to imitate that and to desire to make something that is open to a legal science or legal criticism, and that transforms custom into something that is greater. And so at the time of Western Europe in late 11th and early 12th centuries, you've got people that are very loosely politically organized and overlapping structures of like very local units, lordship units, clan, tribal units, and then larger units, up into like empires that you have, like the Frankish kingdom at one point. So you have very large and small scale societies all existing in nested and complicated overlapping jurisdictions. And you start to get the idea of lords and vassals, where someone is someone else's man, someone is lower. A vassal is someone who's lower, who's serving a lord, and so they are someone who overlooks and is delegated power to by their lord, and that there is the spread of this kind of relationship of lords and vassals that happens by the Normans conquering of England and southern Italy and the Crusaders going into Palestine. You have this feudal law being transported across Europe in part by Norman conquest and Crusader movements. And Berman uses a few different criteria to start to understand the development of legal codes. So he uses objectivity, universality, reciprocity, participatory adjudications, integration, and growth as factors to look at to start to understand the development or creation of legal systems. And so he with feudal law and also manorial law, he kind of brushes very quickly over objectivity and universality, but he does argue that in the late 11th and early 12th century, feudal law becomes a more well-defined system, and it becomes more consistent throughout Western Europe. And so local idiosyncrasies start to wear away, and it becomes something that is able to be scientifically analyzed and critiqued and updated by legal scholars. And it's not just something that defines custom for a particular locality. And then something that is the reciprocity of rights is actually one of the most important things that we see within the feudal system, where the lords and vassals are oftentimes someone who's a lord is oftentimes also a vassal, and someone who's a vassal is oftentimes someone else's lord. And so because you have such complicated and integrated nested hierarchies within the stratified society that was Western Europe at the time of this law, people would occupy both these spaces, because unless you're the king, where you are no one's vassal and you're only a lord, or you're a peasant, you're just, or you're at the bottom of the status hierarchy, and you're no one's lord and you're only a vassal. Very often you're both a vassal and a lord. So the reciprocity of rights and how vassals and lords relate to one another, it's very hard to look at those relationships as attempts to power grab by vassals, or power grab or restrict the abilities of others as something that is purely selfish or something like that, because most people both benefit from expansion of power of vassals and expansion of power of lords, because they share both those responsibilities. And so this creates a kind of interesting dynamic throughout the development of feudal law. And then with the weakness of when talking about participatory adjudications, feudal law becomes more important as well in the late 11th century onward, because there's an increased weakness of royal power, and so royal courts aren't able to adjudicate problems that they normally would have been able to, and so feudal courts end up taking those places, and so they offer a means of dispute resolution between vassals and lords, but it also serves as a space for consultation and deliberation of matters of common concern for people who are lords and vassals. And so this could be aids paid by vassals for military campaigns, rules concerning common forests or fields. So these kinds of decisions that affect lords and vassals would be worked out and decided and deliberated within feudal courts. And then integration, there's an increased ability of feudal law to work with other legal codes, and then also as time goes on, ideas of heritability and alienability of fiefdoms becomes more well worked out, and it becomes a more sophisticated system of law in that regard. And then in terms of growth, the definition of what is feudal law becomes more well defined and does spread throughout Western Europe, starting in the late 11th century throughout the next couple of centuries. And so that's kind of all I have prepared on feudal law.
I when you were talking right at the beginning, I noticed something that maybe we could riff on a little bit, and I think it's relevant to a lot what we were talking about previously too. That early on in the book, he makes very clear. He says, "Well, I'm talking about the origins of a legal system in the West, but I certainly don't deny there being a legal order before this period that I'm talking about, the Papal Revolution." So when you said early on that feudal law and manorial law, they certainly existed to some degree, you know, in the 8th, 9th century when they're developing, when the kingdoms of Europe are sort of coming into shape. But we don't call it a law, or we don't call it we don't call it a system in the same way. So just in the past, in the previous section, when we were talking about the difference between custom and then being brought into law, I think if you guys agree, that's what he meant by having a legal order existing previously, but then becoming a system. And there's a little bit of a discontinuity between the two periods when the system arrives on top of the order that might already exist. And another thing that you said is that to help us maybe define the difference between those two things, the order and the system that we are talking about that's developing, is you said that all of a sudden this became something that the feudal law became something that scholars could talk about. So that previously scholars could not talk about it in a general universal way, but now they can. Now that doesn't summarize it, but that's something about a system that an order doesn't have. Someone in Bologna, in the University of Bologna, is able to talk about feudal law in England intelligently and not be just like making stuff up, right? And so I think the best example of this that I thought that was really, really cool, by the way, these two chapters are I've read a bunch of like random sources on feudal law and manorial law before, but these are by far the clearest that I've ever read, actually. And especially when he's talking about heritability, right? So he talks about the whole vassalage process where he holds their hands and then they kiss. And that's how the Lord makes someone their vassal. And that's very clear to everyone. But this whole business of when someone dies, what happens to their land? It's if one of my vassals dies, their land is subsumed into mine, but then I pretty much immediately make their eldest son, most often, the vassal again. But we have to go through that process, right? I have to make them a vassal. But so that the fact that my vassalage, or that my vassal, when their vassalage is heritable by their children, sort of comes into being, and it's made objective. So when he's saying objective here, we might think of it as synonymous as something that can be talked about. It develops this character of being able to be discussed at the university level, and not merely as a reference to a local custom. So that's where I see these things coming together.
I see him talking about kind of an evolution towards legality, and what demarks it, I don't know. But basically, the suggestion is that there are acts, and acts repeated on some level, acknowledged and repeated, become a custom, and customs repeated and acknowledged become the custom, and then customs recognized as the custom in certain contexts are recognized as the law, right? And that there's a process in which the mere acts or the order or customs become the law, or the law, legally acknowledged customary law, and then even other forms of ways of becoming law become integrated into the law. So it's not just that custom makes the law, but and I'm not sure how one identifies when the law becomes the law.
And when they're in that final phase, they become something that someone can think, well, this is a law and this is a law, therefore this is a law, even if that third thing was never a custom, right? Was never a repeated act. It's like something that had never made sense before. So in the modern era, when we're developing new technologies, how does property rights work on the internet, intellectual property rights, all those things, we are deriving those ideas from the law, or what we see in the law about these new situations. But we can't say that it's from custom, because those things have never existed before. Those situations have never existed before. So they can't have been previously repeated acts.
Absolutely.
And then custom is something that's a lot less subject to criticism, or a reasoned scholarly critique on how you should use custom to run a society. And so once something gets elevated to this space of law, it becomes something that has a character of being useful beyond the group that it's originating from. So usually when he talks about custom, he talks about it in this chaotic way where no one really knows what's going on, or there's no character of custom that is beyond the local. But something about it being elevated to law becomes something that can be shared and go beyond where it originates, and is open to criticism and critique, and being involved in a larger array of laws beyond where it's originating.
And it relates to our conversation last week about law being and the study of meta laws as identifying concepts and principles. So it's not just this is the way we do it, but this is the principle, or this is the why behind, this is the name of it, this is the why of it, this is when it applies, this is how it relates to other principles. I wanted to re-emphasize something you did emphasize it, but I think it was the thing that I found most interesting about the chapter, and one of the most important points. And actually, just before I say that, how it relates, he's kind of criticizing feudalism, a kind of a Marxian power notion or sociological notion of feudal orders. And he tries to contrast Western feudal law with Russian and Japanese feudalism. You can maybe say that they were all feudal societies, where somehow feudal power relations, feudal customs were followed. But he's making a claim that only in the West did feudal law become this kind of, according to the 6 criteria, objective, universal, reciprocal, participatory, integrated and growing body of law. And what's interesting is it's not just that there are power relations between those who have power and those who are underneath them for kind of political and productive forces driving this structure, but that feudal law becomes a law of property relations. It's not just a law of who has power. It starts that way, just like, I don't know what, he doesn't talk about Russia and Japan, and I don't know if he's accurately characterizing these, but what he's showing is that what starts in power and economic relations moves through this legal consciousness of the age into property relations, which are distinct from who happens to have power, that it's actually legal relations. On 304, he says that between 1050 and 1150, the various forms of personal subjection of vassals to lords became transformed into property obligations. And at the same time, various forms of direct economic domination by lords became commuted to taxes, leaving vassals with substantially more personal freedom and economic autonomy. So it's like this transformation from mere domination to relations according to law. And the second point that this is what you emphasize, but you can make, if you're a vassal, you can make yourself a lord over another. You can he called it sub-infeudization, right? Isn't that what it was? Let me see if I can find it. Sub-infeudation. So you have this chain of reciprocal relations. And you said it, you don't have to be selfish about it. I think you could totally emerge in selfishness, perhaps. But recognizing if you recognize the reciprocality of it, the legal relation, if you are founding your protection of self in a legal relation vis-a-vis your lord, you have to recognize the rights of your vassal to you as your vassal, right? It's the desire to call on the law to protect oneself that requires you to recognize the rights of your vassal vis-a-vis you as their lord. And as he says, you can have so many points of this echoing chain of sub-infeudation. You have tons and tons and tons and tons of people. It becomes so unclear who's in charge. And the sub-infeudation can be fractured, right? So you get these branching trees of like, who's lord? Like, in theory, you have to have all these relations with the people above you, but it becomes too confusing. And so you just have to rest on some kind of legal and monetary relation. And so it's not contractual and it's not equal. There is this hierarchy, but he talks about it as a contract to enter into a status, and the pairings are all alike down the chain. So there's this equality, and that's another source of kind of liberal rights of free people, right? They're free even though they're below someone else. You know, when the lords get Magna Carta signed, it's for them vis-a-vis the king, right? It's their right, but they have to recognize over time the same thing for their vassals. So this equality comes out of respect for law or legal relations, which I don't know. Do you think we're capturing that or communicating it clearly, or?
Yeah, and I think that the point I was trying to make with the there's no the point about selfishness was kind of coming out of that sub-infeudation, where there's no large class of people who are merely lords or large class of people who are merely vassals. So you have a large group of people who are both vassals and lords because of this complex nested hierarchy of sub-infeudation. So that leaves you devoid of having these interest groups that can rent seek for lords' rights alone, because when you advocate for lords' rights as a lord, you're also changing what your lord can do because you're also a vassal. And if you advocate for vassal rights, you're creating, you're having more rights as yourself a vassal, but then the people who are vassals underneath you also have those rights. And so there's this reciprocity and balance to the system that you have with this sub-infeudation that actually protects you against a lot of these power games that you would be able to play if you had this strict two-layered system. If you had a class of lords and a class of vassals, then you can very easily see how this power struggle would play out, where lords fight for lords' rights and try to dominate their vassals, or vassals try to become free of their lords. But when you have this interlaced hierarchy, then you have something that's a lot more complicated and nuanced, where a lot you can see the changes in vassal lord relationships as being done in good faith because of this nested hierarchy of subimputation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a
And
really good point. And but kind of what happens is the people at the bottom, so the serfs are the people that would be closest to that pure vassal, right? And the king is the person that's closest to that pure lord, right? So the barons, but the barons are the military class. So they're the ones that actually have the power. So the fact that that's where most of the military power is in the Middle Ages is really, really important. And so that class always wants to, yeah, as you said, instantiate that vassals have rights, right, over their lord, so that they're never totally dominated by the king.
Yeah, right.
But at the same time, they never want to say lords always have, or that vassals always have rights over their lords, because they have vassals themselves and they want to maintain that middle position, which is maybe why towns are so incredibly important, because they end up being that group that doesn't have vassals under them and and basically only has the king as a lord over them. So in England, at least. And I think that's kind of what Smith's thesis of the development of this is over time. I really do need to reread book 3 of Wealth of Nations soon, because it's so awesome.
Yeah, that is interesting that and it's coming in a future chapter, but the idea that serfs have a way to escape and become a free person integrates them into this, because there is this unfree class or status that's not incorporated into the feudal law, and the escape to cities and the emergence of commercial burgerage, I don't know what you would call it, burgage, it creates another opportunity for a free class to enter into law rather than mere subjection. I think it might be valuable just to also say that there was, you might think that because your lord was the judge, you had to appeal to your lord about your own rights on the whole, that there would be no law. But then in fact, Berman says there were cases in which people appealed to the lord's lord, and in principle you could do that, and there are recorded cases in which people were capable of doing that. So that law did emerge, legal consciousness and legal relations emerged over mere power relations. Should we go to manorial law?
Yeah, I might say one last thing on feudal law that I probably should have prefaced with prior to going into this, but and then we can transition into manorial law. But Berman sees legal institutions as being something that overlaps the dividing line between the socioeconomic and the political ideological factors. And so some people can look at the development of feudal law as being the rise in power of heavy cavalry, and you need a feudal system to raise more knights to be able to fund an effective army. And you might see it as a change in ideological or political factors of balance of power. And he's seeing this as, instead of it being monocausal through either this socioeconomic or political ideological, but rather being this complicated intermingling of these two spheres, and the legal processes emerging from that. And so that's true for feudal law, but that'll also be for manorial law. So we can start going into that.
Can we just say, I'm just looking at the clock, and the last third is quite a lot. So
Yeah.
is there, and manorial is so close to feudal, is there any, maybe like one point that needs to be said? Because it's very similar in form. Maybe just make.
It is very similar. Peasants or serfs were this interesting class of people that kind of were a bridge between free peasant and slaves. They're tied to the land, and they have fewer rights than free peasants, and they have obligations to their lords, but they also can't be bought and sold. They can contract in marriage and stuff like that. So they're this special class of peasants. And then there's less reciprocity that you have within this manorial law, because you have peasants don't have anyone underneath them, so you don't have this nested hierarchy like you have within the feudal law. But you also have changes in the productivity of labor and the ability for peasants to band together and to revolt, to put pressure on their lords. And so he kind of sees the growth of or development of manorial law as being defined by the ability of these serfs to have outside opportunity or to be able to band together. And so the
band
development
together or escape to cities, right?
or escape to cities, which is maybe a good segue into urban and commercial law. But it's these other opportunities that develop outside of manorial law that change the ability of serfs and peasants to act within manorial law, that put pressure for manorial law to change. And then it's also important to emphasize that this is probably the least well defined legal system. So it's not like people were going to Bologna to study manorial law. So there weren't really a class of lawyers for this kind of law, and it's one of the weaker legal codes as a legal code as compared to feudalism or the merchant law or other types of law. But that's a very quick overview.
And I thought it was fascinating that although the serf appeals to the seigneurial court of the lord of the manor, the lord of the manor is not the judge per se. The lord presides, but that there's a participatory system of adjudication of the other members of the manor, and that there is a custom of the manor, and that he cites instances in which the judgment of the seigneurial court goes against the lord, and the lord respects it. So there's this interesting combination of legal consciousness and interests of the lord working together to create a move from mere acts to custom to manorial law. There is a law, and maybe it's the most subject to exception or to power and that kind of thing. There is this, there is a law there to be understood. Let me go really quickly through both chapters. I'll just present them and then we'll see what we want to talk about. Chapter 11 on the merchant law, mercantile law, is basically asking how the merchant class arose and why and how merchant law or law merchant arose. And again, it outlines the move from commercial custom to commercial law. Basically, the rise of commercial activity and the creation of a mercantile class is connected with the rise of urban society as well as moving or traveling merchants. Basically, the explosion of commercial activity due to kind of a demographic explosion of people. There's better, there's more food, the climate's better, invasions have disappeared basically. The plague is not, diseases are less. So there's a huge increase in population, and it creates this opportunity for both greater agricultural output and more people mean more surplus and more division of labor. And so we have an emergence of commercial activity and urban life that didn't exist or couldn't exist in the early Middle Ages, just because the population wasn't there and there wasn't enough food. So you have this new opportunities for commercial exchange, for specialization, for industrialization, and for commerce. Berman emphasizes that it was not just commercial trading, but also new industrial classes in urban society that actually probably was more important of the two out of commerce at this early part of the High Middle Ages. But that these new forms of specialization and commercial engagement created new conflicts, a new need for resolution of conflict, that the customary law, even the parts of the Roman Jus Gentium or law of nations that had dealt with the kind of commercial transactions, wasn't sophisticated enough to answer. And so there was a need for law to resolve these new interactions and disputes, kind of like the reason of coming together. We want to trade. We want to have peace and trade. So how do we create this through a legal body of law? So again, he uses the 6 criteria that Caleb mentioned. So we got objectivity, universality, reciprocity of rights, participation in adjudication, and integration and growth. With regard to objectivity and universality. It's interesting how the commercial law applied to foreigners. So there's an interest in drawing foreigners into trade because you want to trade with foreigners. There's this need to promote commerce. There was an immense universality of how local people would be treated as well as foreigners, just as one example of the generality and objectivity and universality of the rule. Under Reciprocity of Rights, Berman cites the need for fairness. As in economics, we recognize that trade can be win-win. It's always ex ante expected to be win-win by both the parties, but sometimes because of things you weren't aware of, you could be a loser in the trade, right? Looking back retrospectively. And so that there was an interest in promoting the long-term win-win nature of trade to create rules of fairness in the law. So questions of, I don't have the page right now, maybe I can find it in a bit, where he gives various criteria in which a contract would be reversed. And that maybe it's not in the interest of the party losing that case, but it's in everyone's interest to be protected from those kind of common unfairnesses as a way to promote commerce. Participation, merchants were the judges and or elected the judges, and they had as judges of their own cases, they had commercial expertise because some of these cases require a certain understanding of how business is done, and also they had a kind of a summary, fast procedure rather than ordinary procedure with all its complicated rules as you would have in kind of a criminal case, because speed and equity were really desirable. If your time matters to the merchant, and getting perfect justice is not as ideal as getting good enough justice to get on to the next transaction. Integration, he talked about there being a self-conscious idea of a body or system of mercantile law. Again, because of a recognition of competition with other jurisdictions. There are other people trying to regulate commerce. The church, for example, or the crown is trying to regulate commerce. And he talks about jurisdictions actually fining people for going to other legal systems to adjudicate their disputes. You know, it's like, we're in competition, you use the merchant system, or we have to protect our ability to use our own merchant system against competing jurisdictions. And that this jurisdictional competition makes law and bodies of law focal. This competition requires them to think about their own law as a body. And he talks about credit, bankruptcy, and commercial forms as particular examples of new complexity. And then he talks about urban law. It's a very long chapter. The basic idea is, why did urban law arise when it did, specifically when, and what was its character? And his basic thesis is that there was a combination of economic and ideological changes. So there was this demographic population explosion. There was an advantage of manpower and money rents for the king or for lords, to kind of give people this free self-governing status as a city or an urban society that gives them rents, and also military protection against the law. You know, if you're a king, for example, what I understood from the chapter, if I understood it correctly, was that you were free from all kinds of military service to other lords, but that you would be a source of military strength in certain respects or in certain domains for the king, right? So you could be called upon to do military service to protect the area of the city, and perhaps in other respects. And so there's military power for the king, vis-a-vis the nobles, and of course it reduces the income of the nobles as well, right? So in the power relations. So there are these economic and power relations, but he wants to claim that the reason why it happened when it did was the papal revolution, creating idea changes. Again, there's this legal, historical consciousness. There's a secular religious nature to the associations that create cities, or the communes that define the cities, and the guilds within the cities that are inspired by the papal revolution. That is a zeal for reform according to law and according to plural jurisdictions. 363, I think, was a page that seemed most relevant. So he says, where is this here? Yeah, he talks about cities being dependent on concepts and institutions, passions and acts derived from the papal revolution, such as fraternal association, collective oath making, corporate personality, charters of liberties, rational and objective judicial procedures, equality of rights, participation in lawmaking, representative government, and statehood itself. So that's the, I'm trying to, if I would try to be brief, that if I've missed something that you thought was super important, please bring it up. And I think if we want to talk about it, one of the questions I had is, what is, when he makes this distinction at the end between Marxist and Weberian economic political forces driving change versus historical, a historical way of thinking about things. So what characterizes the why, the historical why, or the why of historical change that separates his way of thinking from Marx and Weber?
Yeah, definitely want to get around to that question, but that might be a good place to end on. So I just wanted to hit some things that were interesting throughout the chapters. One thing that's kind of very interesting to note is the existence of, I think it was craft towns. It might have been different, but something of the sort where in Ireland you had, it might have been Scotland as well. You had certain towns that specialized in specific crafts and trades.
Staple
And
towns.
Staple towns, yes. And they had this staple that they produced oftentimes like wool or cloth or something like that. And it made up such a large part of their economy that merchant law would be the primary law of their town, not like any kind of town or town law or other kinds of law. So the merchant law would actually subsume other types of secular law, and that it would become so important that they would actually have foreigners participate in the elections of their mayors.
Because the mayors were judges of the commercial law.
Yes. And so you had this very interesting marginal areas where you have foreigners actually become participants in the elections of people who are running this town or locality, and they're able to do that just because of the need for their representation, because of the importance of trade for the existence of their towns. So it's a very interesting legal move that happens there for the politics of that situation. And then I think the argument that he makes in regard to urban law as stemming from the papal revolution is really well clarified when he starts talking about the northern Italian city-states, or the, not city-states, but the towns and cities that develop in northern Italy, because they are between this Holy Roman Empire and the papal states. So you have the Holy Roman Empire granting cities and cityhood to places to try to create bastions of power that are loyal to him, because he's granting them certain rights that they have a lot more freedom in order to kind of serve as this buffer, and then between the papal states and to secure his position. At the same time, in northern Italy, you have communes forming to back the papal party in this investiture crisis. And so these cities and city governments and city law emerge in northern Italy and southern Germany out of this need to battle and fight out between the Pope and the Emperor at the same time. And so the development of these cities happens in response to the papal revolution in a very concrete and tangible way.
Should we talk merchant law first and then move to cities? Is that a good way to do it? I realized that I thought we were much closer to the end of the time than we are. That's why I was kind of rushing, and I was like, oh, actually, that's not 100% 130 minutes. That's 1 hour 30 minutes. I don't know. I forgot how to read a clock or like a timer. But you're talking about foreigners being able to elect mayors in staple towns. I thought it was super fascinating too. And it relates to this idea of universality. The commercial law seems like people's interests in the city really advance the rejection of status. So whereas in feudal law, you have you contract yourself into a status like marriage. So there's a contractual voluntary element, but then there's this perpetual status, or, actually there are forms of divorce too, but people in urban areas and in trade, it's like they're dealing with this is not a serf or a vassal. This is a person who could trade with me. This is a person who can advance my interests, right? Have you read Simple Rules for a Complex World by
I've heard of it, but I don't know. Who is it by?
Richard Epstein.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of it, yeah.
He emphasizes the way in which law has you can think about law in a simple sense as A hits B under these circumstances. Who's A and who's B? It doesn't matter. If it was reversed, it wouldn't. It's like you can kind of define the law without saying anything about the status of the person, like who the person is, right? Which you can't quite do if you have this hierarchical status, right? Serf hits lord. It's very different from lord hits vassal, maybe it's hard to say what separates the legal relation from a power relation. But here on 342, it's just interesting how people recognize this as the universal law of the world. This guy called the first English book on the law merchant, this guy Gerard Malins states, I've entered the title according to the ancient name of Lex Mercatoria because it is the customary law approved by the authority of all kingdoms and commonwealths. Blackstone calls it the law which all nations agree and take notice of. And then earlier, something from 1473, it's the law universal of the world. So there's this tendency for everyone to be treated equally under it, and for there to be immense universality and similarity between this law in different places, locations. Actually, one of the things that Berman says is that people in cities and people in commerce had more of a sense of their similarity in different countries. As a civilization, urban commercial civilization was more unified vis-a-vis each other than compared to rural society. So now we think about London and England and New York and the United States as how, France and Paris as being somehow more alike one another. But for him, New York, London, and Paris would be urban commercial civilization versus rural feudal. And so this sense of national unity didn't exist. So I don't know, it's just interesting that there's this universality arising from the nature of commerce, the nature to have to deal with strangers, treat them fairly, treat them equally, just get your conflicts over with so you can get back to business.
Okay, I have two big related points. One of them is more urban law, so I'll leave it till then. But so with this stuff on the law merchant and all of what we've been saying about there being a universal across all of Europe and even into the Middle East to some degree, and into North Africa, there being a unified trade community. That problem, and then the problem that all of those communities didn't have a single military authority over them, like was in the Roman Empire, for example. That problem of how they were able to develop like legal stability is the main problem that motivates Avner Greif's work, or that he calls it like the hard problem of medieval trade. The fact that people were able to trade, and there was a degree of international trade in the Middle Ages that didn't just have strict enforcement of property rights, right? So a lot of his papers, the big famous one is on the Maghribi traders, but then he also has a paper with I think it's with with Weingast and Milgram on the Hanseatic League. He has a paper that, and then North, Milgram, and Weingast have a paper on the law merchant and on champagne fairs. And a lot of what these papers are is they're like game theory models that show how the way that they negotiated with each other could keep these reputation mechanisms alive, such that these laws were somehow self-enforcing and kept each other going. But Greif also has a chapter in a book on the podesta, which is something that he brings up in the chapter 2, which is that unique institution in Italian city-states where they would invite someone from outside. It's a little bit like the stable towns where they have foreigners vote, but it's actually they're bringing someone from the outside to make sure that no sort of family clan rivalry within the city is going to totally tip in favor of one or the other, and that this person, since they're from out of town and are more impartial with respect to this local matter, are they're going to be able to join the side of the join the side that has a slight disadvantage and try to balance these things out, right? And I think just the fact that he's fascinated in that question of how they're able to develop a legal order independent of all of the independent of just having one single legal enforcer being the person that puts down those rules is really interesting. And the fact that he's interested in that question, how can you have these super institutions that aren't under a single person's mind, which was kind of the model that North was operating under when he talks about institutions as rules imposed by the elites. That's the development that Greif is trying to make. So Greif is trying to talk about the way that Berman talks about law, and North's understanding of institutions doesn't exactly cover the way that Berman talks about law. So Greif's introduction of game theory and the game theoretic sort of perspective for analogizing institutions in economic analysis and the way that we do it in economics is really important for talking about the way that Berman was to talk about the influence of law. And not only that, but Greif also has the papers on how culture influences, it's kind of like a equilibrium selection mechanism. So I don't know how you would talk about the papal revolution as being the cultural background that in a Greifian sense selects for the institution of everyone, the expectation that everyone has that there is a higher legal order, and that being a precondition to achieving that equilibrium in the first place, which is the way that Greif kind of talks about it. Which I have another video on that on this channel if anyone wants to check it out.
Actually, I'd like to read some Greif with you and talk about it. I would enjoy that. What you're talking about reminds me of in the Mercantile Law chapter, he talks about the credit and good faith. I'm trying to find which page, maybe you can point it out, but he kind of talks about the spiral nature of the ability to create credit and the need to create credit as a spiral of trust and good faith. Do you remember where that was? It's somewhere between pages 351, I think, and maybe 354. So, for example, he says on 351, a system of transferring a debtor's future obligation from one creditor to another could not have been developed and maintained if there had not been a strong belief or faith or trust in both the integrity and the duration of the community to which all creditors and debtors belonged. Indeed, it was only such a belief in the future of the mercantile community that made it possible to measure the value of immediate payment against the value of payment at a later date. Just curious what you think about that statement. And he says at the very beginning of the chapter as well that it's not like commerce created law or that law created commerce, that there was this again iterated relationship, right? It's similar to the meta law that comes in universities in the Roman this practice creates problems, creates solutions, creates reflection solutions. It's like they're relating to one another. He says that the growth of commerce and required law, the successful resolution of law created the possibility of greater commerce. So this is a spiral up in the growth of commerce. But how do you think, for example, this claim on 351 relates to what you were saying about Greif and reputation, that kind of stuff?
Well, one of the phrases that Greif uses when he talks about institutions that is really relevant, I think, to this book is that he says an institution is something that's exogenous to each individual. Like, so with respect to me, the fact that I have to drive on the right side of the road is exogenous to any choice that I make. So it informs my choice in that way. But at the same time, the institution is endogenous to the whole. So it's related to that part whole problem that we were talking about before, and this recursivity that you're talking about, where somehow there's neither the law itself or the following that law is exactly the primary element. Both of them have to kind of come at the same time, but it's hard to figure out historically where they come from. Same thing with reputation. How do you get that reputation off the ground? How do you get the credit, the virtuous cycle of mutually crediting each other off the ground? And I think that, and then where I find it interesting is one of the limits of Greif is he tries to use his system to address the hard problem of institutional change. He thinks that it's easier to discuss. It'll be actually easier to discuss how institutions endogenously change and grow over time. But he still is kind of stuck sometimes in like assuming some parametric shift and then the equilibrium has to shift. But what I've been thinking about is how can you talk about like where we're talking in the medieval ages, there are these overlapping jurisdictions that actually develop these conflicting judgments somehow. And at those conflicting judgments is like a disequilibrium point. It can't be characterized as an institution is there yet. So somehow the legal order has a cloud above it. Maybe in Berman's story, that's the canon law and the inspiration of a universal canon law that's represented by the church and its agents. And that when you reach those incomplete moments, the institution grows. So there was something growing. There was a legal sort of environment. There were scholars and stuff growing, developing ideas about what this law is, so that when we reach those conflicting those conflicting judgments, we can actually grow the whole legal system through that tension on the margin right there. So, and I think that itself can't be formalized into a general equilibrium model of institutions. But so Greif sort of offers a little bit of a partial equilibrium, and then we have to tell this kind of story that Berman is telling to tell the full story of history. And you can't integrate it all into one. And integrating it all into one would kind of be the Marxist way of doing it, right? Where everything is about those initial conditions and then people's interests, and then you calculate from there. And I think that that's not possible. And Greif never claims that that's what he tries to do, but tries to describe institutions in a way that it's easier to describe how they change, and not just like how North does. The king decided to change the law. That's cheapening Greif, or cheapening North, but yeah.
And this raises like what he says on the very last page of the urban law chapter, that there's a difference between thinking about economic relations or political relations alone driving change versus, what do you call it? Talks about understanding the historical significance of circumstances, their meaning to the people involved. And I guess I didn't say maybe how he tries to answer the why cities in the Western sense of a corporate, independent, self-governing body arose when it did. He gives lots of examples of the origins of cities. He starts with, and he gives some instances where he indicates that cities begin to rebel against kind of local powers around the time of the Papal Revolution, because there seems to be this confluence of interests for independence among merchant and industrial classes on the one hand, with an ideological desire to take sides between emperor or pope. And the first city that he talks about is Cambrai, which is a pro-pope papal party city. And it's the desire to be independent. They actually say, we are now a city, we're going to incorporate ourselves, is taking sides in this papal revolution. But he doesn't show that theme is totally exists in all of these cities. I didn't see. I don't think but he brings it up every once in a while. So there is this elements of some of these cities are emerging out of this sense that there is plural jurisdiction as a possibility, and you can take sides and become independent to establish your independence. But also that there are these concepts that are coming out of this legal consciousness that and religious thought. For example, that people would actually swear to the charter, allegiance to the charter and to one another as a brotherhood, kind of a sacred oath, kind of a religious act to establish the community and to defend one another and the law of your city against aggressors and violators. So in some sense, he's saying that the concepts were central, but also that these kind of political battles between Pope and Emperor also played a role in many cases. And the other thing that I thought was fascinating was that cities would adopt the laws of other cities. Like when cities would start to incorporate, they would find a parent city and say, send us your laws and they will become our law. And there are lots of examples of this in terms of London and Paris, I think, and other things like that. But he said the most interesting was this Magdeburg in Germany became the mother law or grandmother law to just tens and tens of other cities. Like I think it said 18 or 20 initially. And then its daughter cities would sometimes give their law to other cities. And so that kind of established the law in the, what was the region? It was like, whichever region of Germany, like all the law basically comes back to Magdeburg's law and how it evolved. You have any thoughts or questions about any of this?
Yeah. You did talk about how cities saw themselves, or urban communities saw themselves as like brotherhoods. And I wondered, Marcus, you might know more about this, but if that relates to a rise in different monastic communities around this time, and if this is related to monastic communities rising in response to the papal revolution, if that's connected also to these urban centers seeing themselves as brotherhoods or communes, and if that's a sort of similar way of like if they're trying to imitate these new monastic communities that are rising from a secular angle, if that makes sense. Do you know anything about?
No, I don't know anything about that, but you're saying it's obviously they both have a similar theme, like as in the whole book, like with the Cluniac. The Cluniacs are like, I mean, all of the monasteries before a certain period were Benedictine, and Benedictine is still the majority, and they're all defined by Benedictine, that they're following a particular rule. But you're right, they don't see themselves as a community, like how these cities sort of see themselves as a community, and then they receive the rule. It's actually, yeah, it's very similar in type, but it could be not a direct thing like cities think of themselves as somehow merchant monasteries, but similar to just what Berman's whole story is that a legal consciousness is developing about this is how bodies of people work. We have laws and we enter into association with others, and we're all searching for a law that works over all of us together, right? And so a similar story plays out in urban centers that plays out in monasteries. Can we say that we're firmly in the urban law section now?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Well, and he talks about guilds perhaps having their origin either in Germanic kind of self-help and mutual protection agencies, and or the I think maybe this is, you look like you were going to say this too, Marcus, that the kind of the Cluniac peace. What was the movement for peace? The
Peace of God movement. I forgot about that.
God movement.
Right, yeah.
And that people would form communes or guilds as kind of self-help and protection, mutual protection brotherhoods that would also have a spiritual moral element. So it wasn't just we're going to band together to protect ourselves and avenge injustices against people in the group, but also that they kind of took oaths to certain kind of moral and spiritual standards to which they would help one another live up to.
And they had a personal union under a patron saint often as well. And it's not totally clear. I didn't see whether the patron saint, because we talk about there's traditions of the patron saint of carpenters or the patron saint of this or that, right? And I don't know if the same patron saint was shared among all the guilds of different cities, or if each city was like, well, we developed and adopted around this saint, and how much the church's formal canonization process of declaring someone a canonized saint or not, how much that had to do with what saints were adopted by various guilds. I wonder, I really don't know, but that would be fascinating to find out. And then that would be, if that was the case, that would be the church providing a part of legal consciousness for people to revolve around. So they would actually be providing that invitation to a particular institution or equilibrium that might not have existed before. It provides the ability to coordinate around the law that governs carpenters in this region.
Right. And of course, he also acknowledges what Smith really criticizes later on was the attempt to collude and be monopolistic, right? This is other function of a guild, which is to regulate for the benefit of the members. In some cases, that's good, but in other cases, it kind of creates that monopoly, ossification, and poverty as a system, as it's kind of, especially as you move on in the middle ages, I think.
Yeah, so guilds certainly provided that protection and security to artisans and traders that might have been necessary, right? Like the Hanseatic League was kind of like a big guild for merchants in Northern Europe. But when we, like what we were talking about earlier, when these guilds need to integrate into a larger system where all of the traders, merchants, artisans, property owners, bourgeoisie are subject to the same law, guilds and that guild legal order might have to kind of be shed for the purpose of a greater integration. And that's maybe something like Smith is saying, like, hey, look, these guilds, maybe they help out certain people or they help security against certain times, but now that we have the legal order provided by the king and the towns in a more secure way, we don't need to respect these guilds as unique legal entities as much as we used to. And actually, maybe we should discourage it. Don't give them so much power. I wanted to mention one thing when I was reading this section, that that urban law, to me, and this is the story that Smith and many other people tell too, felt the closest to me as that model of EE, equal commutative justice, that like Klein talks about as being that base system for liberalism, right? That every other person to me is first presumed an equal, and very rarely we have this superior inferior relationship that's more dominant in feudal law and even in canon law to some degree, with like the bishop over the priests, or the priests over the lay people to some degree, right? And then what I noticed was I've been reading early American documents. I read the Mayflower Compact and John Winthrop's like charter for the Puritan colonies in Massachusetts, and they reminded me very much of the way that urban law is characterized. So when we talk about canon law being that source and whole of legal consciousness for all of Europe throughout this time, it very much seems possible to me that urban law was that for America, right? Because if it's almost entirely Protestants moving into British America, and their legal consciousness is around developing communes to start, and they treat even the farmers and the peasants, what would have been peasants in Europe, as almost like equals in an urban society. So one of these subsystems in the medieval legal system, the urban law, sort of becomes the dominant system as time moves on, as towns become more prominent. And like in America, it becomes the entire legal consciousness. And so everything that you read in the urban law section, you're like, yeah, that's just called fairness. Like that's how I grew up knowing like fairness. But yeah, we're going to vote on things. Of course, we're going to vote on things. What else would be fair? You know? And so that, as opposed to canon law and feudal law and all these other things, is the dominant legal consciousness, I think, for America today.
I on the whole agree, but I think the emphasis should be more on the merchant law as the type of EE justice. In fact, like commutative justice, if you read like Pufendorf and Grotius, they're talking about trade. And the commutations, the moving, it's like it has to do with contracts and trade and that kind of stuff. And although there's a really close interlinking of merchant law and urban law, and they kind of interlayer with one another, Berman does say that urban law, there was an equality as citizen, but not necessarily equality of each person. He actually talks about there being different classes with different, see, from 394, for example, he says that the city was a community of community, or a society of orders, or a state of estates, where each estate or a class, not in a non-Marxian sense, forms an important basis of rights and duties. So while there's a legal equality among citizens, there are separate kinds of rights and duties to various classes of non-citizens, I guess, or classes of non-citizens. It's like there's still hierarchy on some level in the town. In some ways, it's not quite as as the merchant laws, but I see it. I also see it, so I agree. But I think more so the merchant law than the urban law. And he also talks about how, beginning as this kind of constitutional swearing of brotherhood to a charter, as cities move in the medieval period, they move more towards hierarchy, more towards aristocracy. Participation becomes more nominal or more of a veto. And then you do have this separation of the elite families versus the kind of plebeian parts of the city, especially as you go on. So it's there, and importantly there, but with some caveats, and then less so over time, I think, than the merchant law. It's like there's something about the merchant interaction that recognizes the equality of persons more than other forms of political arrangement.
But the equality of citizens, there still is this hierarchy within the city because you have this order of orders. But the equality of citizens is one of the things that he sees as being like very uniquely a Western thing for Western urban cities and Western cities that you don't have in the Middle East or in Asia. And it's this idea of having this brotherhood or sworn allegiance to the city, and that gives you citizenship and rights as a citizen, as being very fundamental to what it is to be a Western city as opposed to a non-Western city. And there is so a lot of that Larry Seaton top individualism within that of you having this special recognition of rights as a person within you being a citizen of the city. I think there's also something, it's a very interesting hierarchy within the German cities where you had daughter and granddaughter cities, where they had the ability to appeal to their mother city or grandmother city when they didn't know how to solve a case or resolve a dispute. And it's this very interesting unidirectional but solution mechanism based very much on consent, in that the mother city doesn't have the right to come in and tell you how to define or enforce the law that you've taken from them. But in cases where you're confused as to how to carry out their law in the way that you want to see it, you can go back up and ask them permission for guidance, and they can come and provide that. So you have,
You can ask for updates as well.
yeah.
So you get this graft of the initial law from them,
Mhm.
but over time, they're older, they're bigger, they have a more sophisticated body of law. You can ask for updates of your legal system
Mhm.
from them.
Yeah, so you have this semi-hierarchical structure, but it's also entirely voluntary, in that the mother city doesn't have to help you solve this legal issue. They don't have to update you. And so they're doing that voluntarily, but also they can't force it on you. And so it's more like their answer is serving as a focal point to the problem that you're facing, as opposed to them, backing their decision with force. So it's a very different kind of appellate legal structure.
And to underscore what Marcus was saying, to bring back what Marcus said much earlier in the conversation, cities are the mechanism for getting rid of this concept of a free versus an unfree class. So even though there may be rights and duties are specified by your class and your function in the city, your equality as a citizen also comes with your equality as a free person. You are no longer, even though the specificity of your rights and duties are characterized by your function and class, you're still a free person. And this being a citizen makes you a free person, and in many cases, escaping to a city, being there for a year and a day, makes you a free person. So that's hugely important for this EE. It's the most stark contrast between inferior and superior is done away with by the city in terms of creating everyone being a free person, even if not totally equal in all respects.
Yeah, that distinction between relatively EE within urban law and then a very superior inferior within the feudal or manorial law, it also plays out militarily as well, where all citizens are required to have weapons for common defense within the cities, but you don't have this professional military class. Whereas within feudal manorial law, you have this special class of knights that arises to serve as the elite defensive units. But then very quickly, the ability to draft and conscript peasants basically is, if not impossible, very difficult to do, and not done on a large scale very often within the feudal aspects of society. And so it's a place where you have this superior inferior relationship also plays itself out militarily, where the superior is the one that ends up having to earn the rights of being a superior, whereas in the equal situation, there is no one there who's above you to defend you. And so you have to have this common pool military defense as opposed to training elite soldiers to fight. So it plays out at all the stratifications of society.
Totally. Any closing thoughts for anybody?
Okay, can we talk a little bit more just to close about those last few pages, which are like incredible? Because it reminds me a lot of all of the conversations surrounding McCloskey and such, and the way that she frames a lot of her stuff as well. Most economists sort of passively are doing Marxist sort of economics, right, where everything is about the material, the power, interest, and such. But we have to pay attention to the ideas and the moral approvals and such like that, right? And at least partially what Berman is saying is, well, the moral approval for markets was actually possible in the Middle Ages. He says that when he's sort of contradicting the Weber-Tawney thesis that he talks about a little bit. But those last few pages when he says, well, it's not just about ideas. It's not just about ideas as they unfold, and history follows the unfolding of those ideas. But it's also not the other way, of course, too. It's not just about material unfolding and then a superstructure on top, just sort of reflecting people at the time, what they think, and all that is derived from the material base. And so and I've heard many people say that, and I've said that myself many times, sort of in like putting Marx on one side and then other sort of intellectual, it's all about history of ideas on the other side. But I've never heard someone really properly name what's in the middle. And I had an article on the Econ Playground a while ago that I called the marriage model, and I called it like somehow the marriage between the material and the ideal. But what he uses the word historical, which is really interesting. He says it's about, and from what I can capture and what he says, I should probably go ahead and just read it, huh? I'm not sure, but I mean, it's really two whole pages. Whoever's listening to this, pages 402 to 403, you've got to go there. 402
to 403, yeah, he says, there is in fact no such thing. Well, he distinguishes between the Marxist Weberian pairing of economic and political power driving things as the materialistic terms. He says legal institutions in the West are neither explained in idealistic terms or solely as a manifestation, that is solely as a manifestation of pre-existing concepts, nor in material terms, solely an instrument for exercising economic or political power. He says there is in fact no such thing as social, economic, and political conditions or forces alone. They are always in the context of perception and feeling. Nor are their values, ideas, or beliefs alone. As a social matter, they are always interconnected with material interests. Power is also an idea. Justice is also a force. Neither, quote unquote, causes the other in the physical science sense of the word. To understand why a historical change occurred, one must go beyond the interrelationship between ideas and material conditions to the times and circumstances themselves, not only to recount them, but to show their historical significance, their meaning for the past and the future. What does that mean? What is that historical middle ground?
I think at least part of it is saying that the ideas matter, but they kind of matter in the way that they land and where they land, right? And so what a historical event doesn't make sense unless it is material. It happened in a time and in a place, but it also doesn't mean anything unless it had a sort of an idea behind it, or a motivation, or a sort of larger system that it was a part of, that it came from, right? So it doesn't even make much sense to talk about an event without either of these things happening. And we can't just talk about them as two tracks going along at the same time either. You have to talk about direct historical events. And I thought about people talk about the Bible or something is the foundation of Western civilization. And now what do they mean by that? Do they mean the principles of Christianity that people derive from the Bible? That's what motivates us today. That's what we identify with, is those principles and how they guide us today. Or and someone on the other side that would say, well, no, what characterizes us today is our material conditions and the fact that we have power and they don't have power, or we have power in this particular way. But to say something like the Bible is the foundation of our civilization, or is to point that it's a whole history, because the Bible is not that list of principles. It's a whole story about the world, and it's got the ideas, it's got the Weber stuff,
and it's understood differently by different people, right? I mean, and how they interact with one another and how they're thinking, and some of that's motivated by problems that they're facing, right? Political problems or that kind of thing, right? There's new heresies arising because there's all these people now, and they're living on their own and they're talking to each other, and like heresies up again. Oh, okay, so we got to go and like address this. So now we're going to preach and talk and reread the Bible and address these historical problems and find things in the Bible that weren't found before, or interpret them in new ways, or right. He does say something about what he means by the historical significance at the very last sentence. He says, in addition to the objective materialist why and the subjective in idealist why, there is a historical why. M dash, a why that adds to the outer and inner dimensions of the inquiry, both a past and a future dimension. So this material why is the outer why, the external forces. There's an inner why, the internal forces of ideas. But the historical why, which is added to those, is this dimension of past and future. And he says a little bit higher, they must be understood as significant historical events and as parts of a significant sequence of historical events. A significant sequence of historical events. So what does a past and a future dimension add to the materialist and subjectivist components of understanding a why?
I guess if you didn't have a past and a future, you wouldn't be pointing it at any particular historical moment, right? So in a model, you have maybe someone's utility function, their motivations, and then you have the constraints, and then you say, when you have these constraints and these motivations, this is what happens, right? This is what comes out of it. But you don't locate that, and then we use that model and basically put it in any period in history. And I think what he's saying is that it's possible for them to interact in different ways at different historical moments because of how people interpret. I mean, I suppose in a way you could incorporate that in a model with time and expectation of the future and a set of information or beliefs from the past. But maybe that's what he's saying, is that you have to locate things in historical moments to understand how they work. You can't, he's like doing, it's not like just Austrian economics, but it's a kind of economics that always wants to contextualize any prediction in a moment. So
Well,
that makes
some interpretations of Austrian economics could just be that subjectivist concept and the material constraint without a history.
yes.
You know, but others would say, here's another line that's touching on it. He says, knowing these events are not merely manifestations or instruments, they happen, and knowing when and how they happen as a part of what larger happenings, as part of what larger happenings they happened, helps us to understand why they happened. So it's like, I guess it's addressing this law and revolution right here. This idea of the papal revolution is part of the larger happenings in which each of these things happen. So it's like, but wouldn't you say that's just ideas? I don't know. I'm just, why not reduce this to either material or idealist or some kind of interaction of the material and ideal? I'm not sure still what the dimension of past and future happening as a part of other happenings, what does that add that's different from those other two things or their combination?
Yeah, it is tricky, and I'm not sure I get it. So I definitely see what he's talking about a lot more clearly when he's trying to reject a solely idealist or materialist perspective on history, and trying to see you at least need bridges between these two things and the interaction between these two spheres to understand what's going on. And he importantly sees law as being the thing that spans these two camps, right? He sees
the understanding of law requires this
yes.
kind of understanding. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's building these bridges, but then every moment in history is a part of a greater story in history, might be what he's getting at. And so if you lose this dimension of where the path of where you're coming from and then where you're going, it's like looking at just a part of a painting, or looking at the leg of a chair and understanding it in isolation without seeing the whole. And you're never going to understand that thing. You're never going to understand a leg of a chair just by looking at a leg of a chair, devoid of looking at the whole chair. And so if you're looking at something in a certain moment, but then you're not seeing how it relates to where it's coming from and where it's going, then you're missing the purpose that it's serving in solving and resolving previous problems, and how that leads into
and how the of the solving has come out of what's come before.
Yeah. And so it's this fact that in every particular moment, people are resolving problems from the past, from a new perspective that captures the past in a certain way. They have a certain vision of the future, and that is necessary for understanding why they're doing what they're doing, more than just the material and ideal or idea driven components of what they're doing.
I think the word that captures that, what you're saying, is tradition. I don't know if this is backward for you or right up, but I think what you're talking about is a tradition, like to understand. And he talks about cities having a historical consciousness about themselves and understanding themselves as a tradition. That is something that has a body, that has a past, that's growing and has a future, and that you're part of growing the future out of the past, right? So it's like historical awareness is an awareness that that any event is part of a tradition, and that perhaps also we're part of a tradition. We have to have historical awareness about ourselves. Is not, I hold this idea and I'm facing these circumstances, but where did this idea come from? What is its movement? What are its potentialities? How do the problems that I'm facing emerge from the past? And how are the resources to address that problem? Where are they in the past and in the movement? And how do we go forward, not merely from some kind of Cartesian cogitation, but through reflection on a tradition and its self-understanding as being part of a tradition or being a history. Let's think about, like Oakeshott says, man is a history, not a thinking substance, but a history.
I think if you take, for example, the Christian story, the entire Christian story is supposed to be the story of, across all of time, man's union with God, man's ultimate union in relationship with God, and then you think of as a single principle, that sort of an abstract principle that's part of that story is the love of God or something like that, or God's love for people. So when he says that this story can't be about manifestations, it's not just, oh, well, that one time that a mother took care of her child, or that one time that someone gave, $20 to a beggar, right? Those are manifestations of the love of God. But he's saying you can't just say, oh, well, look, we made a union between the principle and this material moment, and so we've solved that distinction. He says you also have to say when and where and how it happened, because they all have to be part of that larger story. So only saying what the principle is and where the principle landed doesn't solve or summarize this issue. It's actually you also have to say when and where it happened, or else you don't understand its role in the greatest overall history. Maybe that, at least that's part of it, or
Very
any other story that it's part of.
Well, and it's unifying what we were talking about last week with what we're talking about now, which is when you bring up the Christian story as it's understood by the papal party and the papal revolution, it is a concept that there is a passage of time that has a purpose, and that it's moving, that it's come from somewhere and that it's going to somewhere, and that our actions are a part of it. So this kind of traditional or historical consciousness, as well as the legal consciousness, come out of this revolution of ideas or religious ideas. And so when he's saying that the cities saw themselves as we can say as a tradition, but as a growing body, that comes out of religious ideas, or ideas of, we are in a process of sanctifying the world through our actions, right? And preparing ourselves for the good that's coming, or whatever that is. Yeah.
There's an article that maybe I'd recommend by a American Orthodox priest from the early 20th century called The Predicament of the Christian Historian. And his main point is something like, well, this idea that there is a time and that there is this grand story that we need to understand the nature of is very core to Christianity, and that all historians are kind of trying to answer or replace this Christian, not all historians, but in many ways, historians are trying to at least answer or replace part of this thing. But how is a Christian historian supposed to engage with that, since they have to recognize their set of ideas as kind of the origin of talking about history in that way? And yeah, it's super fascinating.
Cool.
And I guess we can kind of end on that.
Sounds great. Thanks, everybody. We stick on for a couple of minutes after the call.
Sure. Yeah. And yeah, thanks everyone for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.